how does God help us to make application of His truth to our life in various needs? Now, last week we talked about God's app for betrayal. And in a sense, that's somebody's action against us. But today I want to talk about it from the flip side. What about God's app for regret? Which is when we do something wrong. When we do something that we regret. If you listened to Job, when we read from Job earlier, that's one of the most painful passages I can imagine. Job is beside himself. Job has great, profound regret. When you listen to the psalmist, and this may be David in Psalm 51, there's profound regret. There's profound sorrow at what has happened, at what has gone wrong in life. Psychiatrist Scott M. Peck wrote of meeting a depressed 15-year-old boy named Bobby, who was increasingly troubled after his 16-year-old brother killed himself with a .22 rifle. Peck tried to probe Bobby's mind but got nowhere. Searching for some way to establish a bond, he asked what Bobby had received from his parents for Christmas. "A gun," Bobby said. Peck was stunned. "What kind?" "A .22. More stunned. "How did it make you feel getting the same kind of gun your brother killed himself with?" "It wasn't the same kind of gun." Peck felt better. It was the same gun. Bobby had been given as a Christmas present by his parents the gun his brother used to kill himself. When Peck met with the parents, what was most striking was their deliberate refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing on their part. They would not tolerate any concern for their son or any attempt to look at moral reality. 2 decades later, and after his conversion to Christianity, Peck wrote about the encounter. "One thing has changed in 20 years. I now know Bobby's parents were evil. I did not know it then. I felt their evil, but had no vocabulary for it. My supervisors were not able to help me name what I was facing. The name did not exist in our professional vocabulary. As scientists rather than priests, we were not supposed to think in those terms." Interestingly enough, although Peck often worked with convicted prisoners, he rarely found evil there. He finally decided the central defect of evil is not the sin, but the refusal to acknowledge it. This definition is reflective of Jesus' far greater severity in dealing with religious leaders than with prostitutes and tax collectors. God's app for regret, I think, begins with that acknowledgement of self. That we have done things wrong. That we have made tears in our life. That we take responsibility for the fact that we have faltered, failed, and injured others. That the same capacity for evil that we want to cringe from in Bobby's parents is the nature of what we can do and perhaps on occasion have done to each other. to admit that I even have the capacity for evil is sometimes problematic. I want to think I'm a good guy. Good guys don't do that kind of stuff. But all of us, each of us, Job included, David included, me included, Paul included, all of us have the capacity to do things that we should regret. So God's app for regret begins with an admission that we can and have done wrong. But Paul goes beyond that. Fairly quickly in Philippians, he talks about losing what is past. He talks about losing all of the things that he may have even counted as gain. That he counts that, he says, as rubbish, as trash, as something to be thrown away. Renee got me out in the garage yesterday. There were things there that needed to be thrown away. I regret to tell you, there are still things there that need to be thrown away. It is difficult sometimes to lose, to get rid of, to count as loss those things that bind us to our past. It doesn't need to be a precious object. It just needs to be something that reminds us of something. It may be something that we really do regret. I came across a book of readings from a class that I took in my PhD program. I don't need that. Chances of my using a single article out of that entire booklet is highly remote, shall I say. But I just don't want to throw that away. And because I don't want to throw it away, I just can't get past certain things. Paul needs to come to my garage. Actually, Jesus needs to come to my garage to help me get rid of the things that pull at me, that define me in ways that I can't even begin to fathom. I need also to put away the regrets, to put away the past, to put away those things which I have done wrong that I do regret. I need to move past those things. I need to lose what is past. During the Great Awakening, when the Spirit of God revived much of the United States' great early faith, Jonathan Edwards was presiding over a massive prayer meeting. Jonathan Edwards later became the president of Princeton University. He was a tremendous preacher. 800 men prayed with him. Into that meeting, a woman sent a message asking the men to pray for her husband. The note described a man who had become unloving, prideful, and difficult. Edwards read the message in private and then, thinking that perhaps the man described was present, made a bold request. Edwards read the note to the 800 men. He then asked if the man who had been described would raise his hand so that the whole assembly could pray for him. 300 men raised their hand. And now, that's a great story. But chances are, 500 other men should have raised their hand. Right? Is there any one of us who wants to claim that our past is perfect? Is there any one of us that wants to claim that we on our own merits can stand before God and His righteousness? Is there anyone here that has no regrets? And yet God, in His mercy, tells us that we can count those things as loss. That we can turn those regrets into something else. That we can lose what is past. That we can forgive and receive forgiveness even for ourselves. That may be the hardest person you have to forgive is yourself. Losing what is past. When we do that, we gain a future. Beth Botts of the Chicago Tribune says this: when we do something wrong, we normally feel guilty, and guilt feels bad. So do shame and a sense of conviction over wrongdoing. These emotions can be so painful that we think they're a sign that something is wrong with us and that God wants nothing to do with us. Actually, just the opposite is true. For example, my wife has long loved mushrooms. Now, I'm not a mushroom guy. In fact, at the smell of mushrooms on my wife's plate, I've been known to ask, how can you eat fungi? So naturally, when I see mushrooms in my yard or someone else's yard, I think that's a sign of something bad. What a surprise when I picked up the Sunday paper and saw on the front page of the Home and Garden section a spread of photos on various strange-looking mushrooms, including a big and ugly orange mushroom that looked like an alien, and read this subtitle: "They're sometimes marveled at, often misunderstood, but there are good reasons to welcome mushrooms that pop up in our yards." That piqued my curiosity. I just had to read about fungi. The author wrote, why are mushrooms important? Because fungi are nature's recyclers. They take a major role in breaking down plant material to feed other organisms, including plants and animals and people that eat them. Without fungi, life on land would be buried under undigested leaves and dead trees. Mushrooms are actually just the occasional sign above the soil that fungi are alive and well within the soil. In the same way, when we do something wrong and feel guilty, that's just a sign that the soil of our heart is still healthy enough to know we've done wrong. The fact that you feel true guilt and shame over your sin shows there is hope for you. God can still work in your soul. Paul says, putting aside what is past, I now press forward to the goal. I know what I should not do. I know from my past what I should not be involved in. Now I can set my eyes on a better future. I can set my eyes on Christ. And the things that I suffer now, the things that I go through now, those things I can count not as God chastising me for something that's happened in my past. I can count them for Christ. I can count them as sufferings for Jesus. I can let them peel away from me those things that I should not let bother me in my life. I can let them strip away from me those weights that would encumber me. I can press forward as an athlete does toward the goal of knowing Jesus fully and Him knowing me fully. This is the future that you and I can gain as we put aside regret. And that leads to the creation of a new heart. The psalmist, perhaps David, says in Psalm 51, "Create in me a clean heart, God. Renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord. Author Rose Sweet writes, I flew to the Midwest to visit my little brother, Fred, one of the top spine surgeons in the United States. Fred picked me up at the airport and told me he could either drop me off at his house to visit with his wife and her kids, or I could go with him to Children's Hospital where he'd just been called in for an emergency procedure. He would outfit me as a medical student and I could watch him perform the surgery. I agreed excitedly without stopping to think about what I was going to see. Are you kidding? Let's go. Wearing blue scrubs, booties, cap, and mask, I stood by Fred alongside a gurney while he talked to the patient, a 12-year-old boy. The boy's leg had been injured just below the knee in a playground accident. Dr. Fred assured him everything would be okay. He was wheeled quickly into the operating room. 4 days earlier, the emergency room doctors had sewn the wound up and sent the boy home. However, he had developed a high fever, and when it reached 105 degrees, the parents, worried and in tears, brought him back. It turned out that the improperly cleaned wound was still filled with gravel, and some of the skin around the sutures had died and was spreading to healthy tissue. The boy's body was racked with infection, and the fever had signaled what was going on behind those stitches. I'll never forget watching a sight that was together the most gruesome and the most awesome that I think I'll ever see. Within minutes, the medical team had the boy under general anesthesia, draped and ready for surgery. I was shocked at how aggressively Fred removed the stitches, reopened the wound, and stuck his sterilized and gloved hand right down into the boy's bloody leg to clean it out. As I stood nearby, I watched as my baby brother's skilled fingers quickly cleaned away flesh and bone, around flesh and bone, and then delicately cut away the tissue that was infecting the rest of the leg. After the wound was cleansed, Fred directed the assistant surgeon to close up while we left to find the boy's parents. The operation went well, Fred told them, and he gave Mom and Dad steps for follow-up care at home. You see, there are things in our life that if they remain there, they can kill us. That if they remain there, they will spread like infection through us, and they will destroy us. There is no sin in your life that is created. There is no sin in your life that contributes anything positive to you. It only contributes that which destroys, that which infects, that which spreads death in your soul. God, out of His love, out of His desire to preserve your life, out of His desire to bless your life, is like a skilled surgeon, like Fred, whose skilled hand reaches in and pulls at those things that we regret. Pulls at those things that cause us guilt. Pulls at those things that cause us shame. Removes them from us. And binds our wounds to heal us fully. I don't know about you. I've still got things in my garage. I don't know about you. I've still got things in my life that I need to allow God to rip open and remove and cleanse and heal. There are a number of ways you can do it. I found it helpful to find somebody that I can talk to about it. I found it helpful to be able to pour out my regret to some tangible person that can communicate to me that God forgives me. Other people can do it simply through prayer. Simply through opening their heart and their life to God, the great physician, who removes that from them and restores them. However you need to do it, get on with it. I suspect if you don't, your fever will rise. I suspect if you don't, you will have regret upon regret that you didn't do it sooner. Whatever you've torn up, let God